Christopher Daniels, I don't think in any of the podcasts, really, his name comes up very often, which it should, because he was one of the real homegrown stars of TNA, even though he'd been in
Yes.
WWF very briefly in a couple of other places, and he'd just been around the business for years at that point. He was one of the real stars of the early years whose name might get lost in the shuffle more than an AJ Styles might do. But any more thoughts on Mr. Daniels there?
Yeah, when we talk about that era of TNA, it seemed to me that at that time, our one ace in the hole, our one bright spot was that X division. There was, at the heavyweight division, there was a whole lot of in and out. This big name comes in and it's gone. This big name negotiates, come in, but doesn't come. There was a whole lot of that. But the X division was that one standard that we knew during each show we could put out there, and that segment was going to, rock it. And AJ gets a lot of that credit, and rightfully so. But there were a lot of guys into that, in that X division, that were bringing that to the table. So it wasn't just the AJ Styles segment, although it would often showcase AJ. Christopher Daniels was one of those guys too, that was out there and, would often wrestle AJ, or they'd have, those X division matches where they had the cable crossed over, and they were getting really creative. Now, some could argue today that this was the foundational points of Spot Monkey. But to me, I remember a lot of conversations with AJ, especially, trying to wrap his brain around the storytelling and the psychology part. How can we make this make sense? And that was a quite often discussion with AJ, and making it make sense. And Christopher Daniels too. Chris would come around and say, "Can I ask you a question on something?" And he would lay it down and say, "Okay, how can we get here?" And always attentive. All those guys, Michael Shane, all those guys then, Frankie Kazarian, all of those guys were eager to learn. It wasn't like you're hearing today with nothing. Well, why ask Shane? He can't teach us anything. Or why ask Dusty? There's nothing he can tell us. They seemed quite interested in learning and taking it in. But by proxy, I think as the company began to lean on them more, they were, how do I say this without like sounding controversial or maybe saying it the wrong way? As the company leaned on them more and more, I think they began to feel that pressure more and more. And so felt the compulsion to try to, I guess, throw more of what they could do in there, because, hey, we got a 20-minute match on the pay-per-view tonight, and that's a pretty good chunk of time for television. And so instead of doing what would have made better sense and to do that stuff and then set it up and come to it, it became, let's just throw more of that stuff in. And and I think there was a wow factor. There's always going to be a wow factor to it, especially from fans that have grown up and watched, wrestling style matches. But I think that, the argument could be made that this is like where we start to really see it take hold in America of what would become Spot Monkey. And then suddenly it's just moves for move's sake. Those guys, especially Christopher and AJ, and certainly Michael Shane and really all of them, like Sonny Seagal, all those guys were coming and asking questions. And when you sat down to go over matches with them, they were typically Jerry would do the agenting of those matches, but they would come over and ask something. But you could see them and sitting with Jerry, like there was a long. You might walk by an hour ago and come back an hour later, and they're still going over something. So like it was clear to me that they were being diligent about the craft. And I think as TNA began to lean on them more, it started putting more pressure on them. But where TNA made the mistake with the X division was suddenly we're not going to disband the X division. We're just going to start throwing the X division guys in with all the other guys and sort of muddy that up. And that was where I think it started taking it off. I mean, let's face it, if you're going to be in the ring with, say, Kevin Nash, you're not going to be able to go in there and do quite as much of that. So it tones it down and pulls it away from that. And suddenly the X division, the one bright spot that we had, the X division was sort of just wrapped into everything else with no real explanation to it other than we just do it. And, you know, there was a whole lot of different things going on at that time like that, that weakened the X division, watered it down, and then assimilated it into the other stuff. And there was never any real explanation to that. As to the one bright spot the fans were coming and seeing and loving, now suddenly we're seeing less of that because they're joining them up in different ways and pairing them up with opponents that may or may not be able to showcase them the same way. So it was noticeable to us. I know Jerry and I would talk about it quite often. And I think Jerry at the time felt sort of like they were being squeezed out because, you know, he was concerned about, like, you know, are they going to keep him around? Because if they don't have an X division, they're not going to have that. Just a whole lot of those types of business wrestling concerns that come up that don't even need to be broached. You just create them to create the issue.